Welcome to Marple Whispers, where the quietest words carry the deadliest secrets. I'm Sean, and together we'll wander through drawing rooms, dark alleys, and dangerous whispers. Listen closely. Miss Marple is never wrong. A sun-kissed Cornish village hides a deadly secret. Artist Joyce Lempriere sketches by the cliffs when she spots a chilling crimson stain. Blood spreading on the pavement, only to vanish like a ghost. Nearby, a tense couple, Mr. and Mrs. Dacre, argue in whispers, their second honeymoon, reeking of lies. As whispers spread, Mrs. Dacre disappears, leaving a forged note and a trail of clues. A stained scarf washed ashore, a hidden boat fleeing the waves, and Joyce's sketches revealing shadows of murder. Enter the unassuming sleuth, Miss Marple, whose sharp mind unravels the web, debts, desperation, and a husband's greedy plot. He drowned her in the shallows, using her own red paint to stage a fake crime on the pavement, distracting all while the tide erased the truth. But Miss Marple sees through the illusion, exposing the killer's fatal slip. Chapter 1. The Seaside Idyll. The Cornish coast in high summer possessed a deceptive tranquility, where the relentless crash of waves against jagged cliffs masked secrets whispered by the wind. Rathole, a forgotten speck of a village clinging to the edge of England, drew those weary of London's fog and frenzy, artists, dreamers, and perhaps those with darker reasons for seeking solitude. Its narrow lanes twisted like veins through weathered cottages, leading inexorably to the harbor where fishing boats bobbed like reluctant sentinels. Overlooking it all stood the Polharwyth Arms, a rambling inn of faded grandeur, its whitewashed walls etched with salt and stories. Joyce Lempriere had chosen Rathole for its raw beauty, the kind that begged to be captured on canvas. A woman in her late 20s, with a cascade of dark curls, often pinned haphazardly beneath a wide-brimmed hat, she possessed the keen eye of one who saw not just surfaces, but the shadows beneath. Her seascapes had begun to garner notice in modest London galleries, vibrant swirls of turquoise and indigo that hinted at tempests brewing just beyond the frame. This summer, she had escaped the city's stifling heat for the inn's modest attic room, where the sea's murmur lulled her to sleep and inspired her dawn sketches. On that particular afternoon, the sun hung high, gilding the promenade with a golden haze. Joyce positioned her easel near the cliff's edge, where the pavement gave way to a sheer drop onto the pebbled beach below. The air was thick with the tang of brine and the distant cry of gulls wheeling overhead. She dipped her brush into a pool of cerulean blue, her strokes deliberate, coaxing the ocean's mood onto the canvas. It was then, amid the rhythmic hush of the tide, that her gaze drifted to the couple approaching along the path. He was a man of middle years, impeccably dressed in a lightweight, tweed suit that spoke of city polish rather than seaside leisure. His mustache was trimmed to precision, framing a mouth that curved in easy smiles, though his eyes, sharp and calculating, betrayed a vigilance unbecoming of a holidaymaker. Beside him walked a woman of striking elegance, her auburn hair swept into a chignon that accentuated the graceful line of her neck. She wore a simple yet expensive frock of pale silk, but her posture told a different tale. Shoulders slightly hunched as if bracing against an unseen chill, and her hand clutched his arm with a grip that seemed more anchor than affection. Joyce watched them covertly, her artist's instinct attuned to the subtleties of human form. They paused at a wrought iron bench facing the sea, the man gesturing expansively at the view while the woman nodded absently, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Fragments of their conversation carried on the breeze, his voice smooth and assured, hers softer, laced with a hesitation that prickled Joyce's curiosity. "A perfect spot for our renewal, darling," he said, loud enough to suggest performance. "Away from all that tiresome bustle." She murmured agreement, but her fingers twisted the edge of her shawl, a small act of unrest that Joyce noted like a discordant note in a symphony. As the afternoon waned, the inn's terrace filled with guests sipping tea and exchanging pleasantries. Joyce, packing her paints, found herself drawn into the circle. The innkeeper, a jovial soul named Mr. Petherick, with a beard like sea foam, made introductions with flourish. "Mr. and Mrs. Dennis Dacre, from the heart of London," he announced. "Here for a second honeymoon. Isn't that romantic?" Mr. Dacre bowed slightly, his charm effusive. "Indeed, Rathole's charms are irresistible. My wife insisted on this quaint escape. Didn't you, my dear?" Mrs. Dacre offered a faint smile, her eyes flickering toward the gathering dusk. "Yes, quite," she replied, her voice carrying a refined accent tinged with weariness. Joyce sensed an undercurrent, a discord hidden beneath the polished veneer. Was it the way Mrs. Dacre's glance lingered on the cliff's edge as if measuring the fall, or the brief shadow that crossed Mr. Dacre's face when his wife excused herself, early, pleading a headache? That night, as Joyce lay in her room, the waves' ceaseless rhythm seemed to echo her unease. Rathole's idyll felt suddenly fragile, like a canvas stretched too thin over unspoken truths. Little did she know, the brushstrokes of mystery were only beginning to unfold. Chapter 2. The Vanishing Stain. The morning broke over Rathole with a crystalline clarity that seemed to mock the unease lingering in Joyce Lempriere's mind. The sun climbed swiftly, painting the cliffs in hues of amber and rose, while the sea below shimmered like a sheet of polished glass. From her attic window at the Polharwyth Arms, Joyce watched the fishing boats bob out toward the horizon, their nets trailing like dark promises. She had slept fitfully, her dreams tangled with images of the Dacres, the husband's practiced smile, the wife's shadowed eyes, and that fleeting moment of tension she had glimpsed on the promenade. Something about the couple gnawed at her, an artist's intuition that saw beyond the surface to the shapes beneath. She descended to the inn's dining room, where the aroma of fresh scones and strong tea mingled with the salty tang of the sea, air drifting through open windows. The room buzzed with early risers, a retired colonel poring over a newspaper, a pair of spinster sisters whispering over their knitting, and a young man in a tweed cap who introduced himself as Arthur Penrose, a botanist studying coastal flora. Joyce, her sketchbook tucked under her arm, took a seat near the window, her thoughts still tethered to the previous day's encounter. As she sipped her tea, Mr. Petherick, the innkeeper, bustled over, his round face flushed with the morning's exertions. "Miss Lempriere, you'll be out painting again today, I wager?" "That spot by the cliffs is a favorite, though mind the tide. It's fierce when it turns." Joyce nodded, her smile polite but distracted. "I thought I might try the promenade again. The light's perfect this morning." She gathered her easel and paints, the weight of her wooden box familiar and grounding. The promenade was a narrow strip of weathered stone that hugged the cliff's edge, bordered by a low railing on one side and the sheer drop to the beach on the other. Joyce sat up near the same wrought-iron bench where the Dacres had lingered yesterday, her canvas angled to capture the sea's restless churn. She mixed her paints with care, cobalt for the water's depth, ochre for the cliff's rugged face, and a touch of alizarin crimson for the warmth of the morning light. It was then that she saw them again. The Dacres emerged from the inn's gate, moving with the deliberate pace of a couple performing normalcy. Mr. Dennis Dacre wore a cream linen suit, his Panama hat tilted at a jaunty angle, while Mrs. Dacre, in a pale green dress that caught the breeze, seemed almost spectral against the vibrant backdrop of sea and sky. They settled on the bench, not 10 yards from Joyce's easel, their voices low, but carrying in snatches over the gulls' cries. "You worry too much, my dear," Mr. Dacre said, his tone light but edged with impatience. "This place is meant to relax you, not stir up old ghosts." Mrs. Dacre's reply was inaudible, her head bowed as she toyed with a silver bracelet on her wrist. Joyce, pretending to focus on her canvas, strained to catch more, but the wind swallowed their words. She noted the way Mrs. Dacre's shoulders stiffened, the way her husband's hand rested on hers, not in comfort, but as if to anchor her in place. Suddenly, Mrs. Dacre stood, her movements abrupt, her face drained of color. "I need air," she murmured, though the irony of the statement struck Joyce, even as she watched. The woman hurried back toward the inn, her heels clicking sharply on the pavement. Mr. Dacre lingered, lighting a cigarette with a silver lighter that glinted in the sun. He exhaled a plume of smoke, his eyes scanning the horizon with a detachment that chilled Joyce. Then, with a casual flick of his wrist, he tossed the matchstick over the railing and strolled after his wife, his gait unhurried, almost leisurely. Joyce returned to her painting, her brushstrokes growing erratic as her mind replayed the scene. The Dacres' discord was subtle, yet it resonated like a false note in a melody. She was mixing a deeper shade of crimson when a sharp cry pierced the air, not from the promenade, but from the beach below. She glanced over the railing, expecting to see a fisherman wrestling with a heavy catch or a child startled by a wave. Instead, she saw only the tide lapping at the pebbles, the water opaque and restless. Her attention snapped back to the pavement when a glint of red caught her eye. Near the bench where the Dacres had sat, a dark, irregular stain spread across the stones, its edges glistening wetly in the sunlight. It was no larger than a man's hand, but its color was unmistakable. Crimson, vivid, and viscous, like blood freshly spilled. Joyce's heart lurched. She set her brush down, her hands trembling, and stepped closer. The stain seemed to pulse under her gaze, its surface slick and unnervingly warm to the touch when she brushed her fingers against it. The texture was sticky, smearing on her skin like paint left too long in the sun. Yet her own palette stood untouched, her reds and crimsons neatly contained in their tubes. "Blood," she whispered, the word escaping before she could stop it. Her mind raced. Had someone been injured? Had the cry from the beach been more than a fisherman's shout? She glanced around, but the promenade was eerily quiet. The Dacres were gone, the distant figures of other walkers too far to have noticed. Panic rising, Joyce hurried to the inn, her easel abandoned in her haste. Mr. Petherick was polishing glasses behind the bar when she burst in, her breath ragged. "There's a stain on the pavement, red like blood," she gasped. The innkeeper's bushy brows shot up, but his tone was skeptical. "Now, miss, let's not get carried away. Could be anything, wine, jam, even some of your paint." Joyce shook her head vehemently. "It's not mine. I didn't spill anything." Reluctantly, Mr. Petherick summoned Constable Trewin, a ruddy-faced man with the slow, deliberate manner of one accustomed to minor village disputes. By the time they reached the promenade, the sun had climbed higher, its heat baking the stones. Joyce pointed to the spot, but her words faltered. The stain was gone. Not a trace remained. Not a smudge, not a hint of crimson. The pavement gleamed as if freshly scrubbed, mocking her certainty. Constable Trewin scratched his head, his mustache twitching. "Well, miss, stones like these soak up liquids quick in this heat. Could have been a trick of the light, or maybe some lad spilled his drink." He chuckled, eyeing her paint-splattered smock. "Or perhaps a bit of your own red got away from you." Joyce's cheeks burned. "I know what I saw," she insisted, but doubt crept in. Had she imagined the stain's intensity, its unsettling warmth? Her paints were secure, her brushes clean, yet the constable's logic was hard to dismiss. The porous pavement, the relentless sun, it could explain the disappearance. But not the cry from the beach, nor the Dacres' strange behavior. Back at the inn, the incident became the talk of the evening. The dining room hummed with speculation, the guests' voices a mix of amusement and unease. Mr. Petherick, ever the storyteller, spun a tale of a long-ago shipwreck where blood had stained the cliffs only to vanish with the tide. The spinster sisters clucked disapprovingly, while Arthur Penrose, the botanist, suggested it might have been a rare algae bloom, washed up and mistaken for something sinister. The Dacres, seated at a corner table, joined the conversation with practiced ease. Mr. Dacre laughed heartily, his cigarette case flashing as he offered it around. "A blood stain, you say? Sounds like the start of a penny dreadful. Likely some holiday-maker's spilled claret." His wife, pale and subdued, managed a faint smile. "People see what they want to see," she said softly, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. Joyce caught the flicker of something in her eyes. Fear, perhaps, or resignation. Among the guests was Carol Reeves, a journalist whose sharp features and quick wit stood out amid the village's slower rhythms. She had arrived in Rat Hole under the guise of a holiday, her notebook discreetly tucked away, but her questions were anything but casual. "Miss Lempriere," she said, leaning closer, "you're certain it wasn't paint? You artists have an eye for detail." Joyce bristled at the implication, but held her ground. "It wasn't mine, and it wasn't like any paint I've ever used. It was too alive." Carol's eyes narrowed, her interest piqued. She turned to Mr. Dacre, her tone light but probing. "You were on the promenade this morning, weren't you? Did you see anything odd?" Mr. Dacre's smile didn't waver. "Nothing but the sea and the gulls, Miss Reeves. My wife and I were enjoying the view. Weren't we, darling?" Mrs. Dacre nodded, but her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, the knuckles white. As the evening wore on, Joyce retreated to her room, her sketchbook open but untouched. She replayed the day's events, the Dacres' tense exchange, the cry from the beach, the stain that vanished as if it had never been. She flipped to her sketches from the morning, her pencil strokes capturing the bench, the sea, and the Dacres' silhouettes. Something nagged at her, a detail she hadn't consciously noted. In the drawing, Mr. Dacre's hand rested on the bench, not on his wife's, and beside it was a faint smudge, barely discernible. Had she drawn it absent-mindedly, or had it been there, unnoticed until now? She closed the sketchbook, her pulse quickening. The stain had been real. She was certain of it. But its disappearance, coupled with the Dacre's unease, suggested something more sinister than a spilled drink or a trick of the light. Joyce glanced out her window, where the promenade lay bathed in moonlight, the bench a dark shape against the silvered stones. Somewhere in Rat-Hole's idyllic facade, a secret was unraveling, and she felt herself caught in its threads. In the distance, the tide roared, as if guarding its own truths. Joyce resolved to watch the Dacres closely, unaware that another pair of eyes, shrewd, unassuming, and soon to arrive in Rat-Hole, would see far deeper into the mystery. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Village. The sun had barely crested the cliffs of Rat-Hole when the village awoke to a hum of intrigue, its quiet lanes buzzing with the tale of Joyce Lempriere's blood-stained pavement. News spread as swiftly as the tide, carried from the Polharwyth Arms to the fish market, from the baker's shop to the weathered benches where old men swapped stories of the sea. By midday, the incident had taken on a life of its own, embroidered with half-truths and wild conjectures. Some whispered of a smuggler's curse, others of a lover's quarrel turned deadly, while the more practical souls, like Mrs. Tregarthen, who ran the post office, insisted it was merely spilled jam from a tourist's picnic. Yet beneath the gossip ran a current of unease, as if Rat-Hole's idyllic veneer had cracked, revealing something darker beneath. Joyce, still shaken from the previous day's events, found herself at the center of this storm. She sat in the inn's dining room, her sketchbook unopened beside a cooling cup of tea, her mind replaying the crimson stain's vivid gleam and its inexplicable disappearance. The other guests cast curious glances her way, their murmurs a low hum against the clink of cutlery. Mr. Petherick, the innkeeper, was in his element, his booming voice weaving the tale into something almost mythic as he served breakfast to a full house. "Mark my words," he declared to a table of wide-eyed visitors. "That pavement's seen more than it lets on. Why, back in '98, there was a sailor washed ashore, blood all over the rocks, and not a soul could say how he got there." Joyce's cheeks flushed at the embellishment, but she held her tongue. She had no wish to fuel the speculation, yet she couldn't shake the image of the Dacres, Mr. Dacre's polished charm, Mrs. Dacre's haunted gaze. Their exchange on the promenade, so carefully staged yet fraught with tension, lingered like a smudge on her canvas. Had they seen the stain? Had they caused it? The questions gnawed at her, as persistent as the gulls outside. The dining room was a microcosm of Rat-Hole's summer crowd. The retired Colonel Bantry, a ruddy-faced man with a penchant for military anecdotes, grumbled about hysterical young women while buttering his toast. The spinster sisters, Mrs. Clara and Emily Vane, exchanged knowing looks over their knitting, their needles clicking like a metronome. Arthur Penrose, the botanist, scribbled notes in a leather-bound journal, his tweed cap perched precariously on his head. And then there was Carol Reeves, the journalist, whose sharp eyes missed nothing. She had taken a seat across from Joyce, her notebook discreetly tucked into her handbag, but her questions were as pointed as her pen. "You're quite certain it was blood, Miss Lempriere?" she asked, her tone casual but probing. "Not some trick of the light or, say, a bit of your paint gone astray?" Joyce bristled, her artist's pride stung. "I know my paints, Miss Reeves. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't like any paint I've ever seen. It was too real." She hesitated, aware of how fanciful she sounded. And there was that cry from the beach just before I saw it. Carol's lips curved in a faint smile, not unkind, but calculating. A cry, you say? Could have been a fisherman or perhaps something more. Dramatic? She leaned closer, her voice dropping. You saw the Dacres there, didn't you? Did they seem upset? Joyce hesitated. She had no proof, only instincts honed by years of studying faces and forms. They were arguing, I think, not loudly, but there was something off. Mrs. Dacre looked frightened, perhaps. Carol's eyes gleamed, but before she could press further, the Dacres themselves entered the room. Mr. Dennis Dacre, impeccable in a navy blazer, greeted the guests with a nod and a smile that seemed to disarm even the stern Colonel Bantry. Mrs. Dacre, in a cream dress that accentuated her pallor, followed quietly, her eyes downcast. They took a table near the window, and Joyce noted how Mr. Dacre positioned himself to face the room, as if keeping watch, while his wife stared out at the sea, her expression unreadable. The conversation at the inn turned inevitably to the pavement incident. Mr. Petherick, wiping his hands on his apron, recounted Joyce's discovery with relish, though he tactfully omitted her name. A great red stain, bold as you please, right there on the promenade. Gone by the time the constable arrived, mind you, but it's got folks talking. Reminds me of the time old Captain Tregellis swore he saw a ghost on the cliffs, blood dripping from its hands. The Vane's sisters gasped in unison, their knitting momentarily forgotten. Colonel Bantry snorted. Nonsense. Probably some lad spilled wine. These artists see drama in every shadow. His glance flicked toward Joyce, who pretended not to notice. Mr. Dacre, however, seized the moment to steer the narrative. A fine tale, Mr. Petherick, he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. But surely it's nothing more than a prank. Holidaymakers can be careless. Spilled drinks, dropped food. Isn't that right, my dear? He turned to his wife, who managed a nod, her fingers twisting a lace handkerchief. People do love to imagine things, she murmured, her voice so soft it barely carried. Joyce's eyes narrowed. Mrs. Dacre's words echoed her husband's, but there was no conviction in them. Her hands, Joyce noticed, trembled slightly, and the handkerchief was fraying at the edges from her nervous twisting. Carol Reeves, ever observant, caught Joyce's gaze and raised an eyebrow, as if to say, "See? Something's not right." As the meal ended, Joyce excused herself and stepped onto the inn's terrace, needing air to clear her thoughts. The sea stretched before her, its surface deceptively calm, hiding the currents that could drag a man under. She was joined unexpectedly by Arthur Penrose, who tipped his cap and offered a shy smile. "Heard about your adventure, Miss Lempriere. Quite the stir. I was down on the beach yesterday collecting samples. Didn't see any blood, but the tide was coming in fast. Washes away most things, you know." Joyce nodded, her mind turning to the cry she'd heard. "Did you hear anything odd? A shout, perhaps, around mid-morning?" Penrose frowned, rubbing his chin. "Can't say I did. The waves were loud, and I was focused on some seaweed specimens. But I did see a boat, a small one, rowing out just beyond the rocks. Thought it was a fisherman, but it moved quick, like it didn't want to be seen." Joyce's pulse quickened. "Did you see who was in it?" "Too far off," Penrose admitted. "Just a figure, maybe two. Could have been anyone." He hesitated, then added, "You don't think it's connected to your stain, do you?" "Sounds like something out of a novel." Joyce forced a smile, unwilling to share her suspicions yet. "Probably nothing. Just my imagination, as everyone seems to think. But as Penrose wandered off, she lingered, her eyes scanning the promenade. The bench where the Dacres had sat was empty now, its iron frame gleaming in the sun. No trace of the stain remained, but Joyce's certainty held firm. It had been there, vivid and real, and its absence only deepened the mystery. By evening, the Polharwyth Arms was alive with chatter. The guests gathered in the lounge, a cozy room lined with nautical relics and faded photographs of rat-holes past. Mr. Petherick stoked the fire, though the summer night hardly called for it, and poured generous measures of local cider. The atmosphere was convivial, yet Joyce sensed an undercurrent of tension, as if the village itself were holding its breath. Carol Reeves, ever the instigator, steered the conversation back to the pavement. "It's curious, isn't it?" she said, addressing the room but watching the Dacres. A stain appears, then vanishes without a trace, almost like someone wanted it noticed, but not examined too closely. Her tone was light, but her eyes were sharp, and Joyce saw Mr. Dacre's smile tighten. "Really, Miss Reeves," he said, lighting a cigarette with that same silver lighter Joyce had noticed yesterday. "You make it sound like a conspiracy. I was there with my wife, and I assure you, we saw nothing but the sea and a few gulls squabbling over scraps." Mrs. Dacre nodded, but her agreement felt mechanical. "It's a busy promenade," she added, her voice barely above a whisper. "People come and go. It could have been anything." Her eyes darted to her husband, then away, as if seeking permission to speak. Joyce, emboldened by Carol's probing, spoke up. "But it wasn't just anything. It was red, thick, like blood. And it was right where you were sitting, Mr. Dacre." The words tumbled out before she could stop them, and the room fell silent, all eyes on the couple. Mr. Dacre's laugh was a touch too loud. "My dear Miss Lempriere, you've a vivid imagination, an artist's eye, no doubt, but you're seeing shadows where there are none. We were simply enjoying the morning air, weren't we, darling?" He patted his wife's hand, but Joyce caught the brief flinch in Mrs. Dacre's posture. Carol pressed further, her voice honeyed but relentless. "Still, it's odd, don't you think? A stain like that, gone so quickly. And that cry Miss Lempriere heard, perhaps it was someone in distress." She turned to the innkeeper. "Mr. Petherick, you've lived here all your life. Any tales of trouble on that beach?" Petherick, delighted to be the center of attention, launched into a story of a smuggler's feud from the last century, complete with hidden coves and midnight scuffles. The guests listened politely, but Joyce's attention remained on the Dacres. Mrs. Dacre had retreated into silence, her handkerchief now a crumpled wad in her lap. Mr. Dacre, meanwhile, maintained his genial facade, but his eyes flicked toward the door, as if gauging the distance to escape. As the evening drew to a close, Joyce slipped out to the promenade, unable to resist revisiting the scene. The moon hung low, casting silver light over the stones, and the air was heavy with the scent of salt and seaweed. She stood by the bench, her fingers tracing its cold iron frame. No stain, no trace. Yet the memory of that crimson smear was as vivid as her own paintings. She glanced down at the beach below, where the tide was retreating, leaving behind a litter of shells and seaweed. Had the cry come from there? Had the boat Penrose saw carried something, or someone, away? A rustle behind her made her turn. It was Carol Reeves, her scarf fluttering in the breeze. "Couldn't sleep either, I take it," the journalist said, her smile conspiratorial. "There's something about this place, isn't there? It looks so peaceful, but it's hiding something." Joyce nodded, her voice low. "I can't stop thinking about the Dacres. They're not what they seem. That stain? It was real, Carol. And Mrs. Dacre, she's afraid of him. I'm sure of it." Carol's expression turned serious. "I've been asking around. Mr. Dacre's a businessman. Imports, exports, that sort of thing. Word is, he's got a temper when crossed. And Mrs. Dacre, her family's got money. Or had it before she married him. Funny how they're on this second honeymoon, yet she looks like she'd rather be anywhere else." Joyce's heart sank. "You think he's dangerous?" "I think," Carol said carefully, "that we need to keep our eyes open. That stain of yours might be the first brushstroke in a much larger picture." As they parted, Joyce returned to her room, her sketchbook open once more. She flipped to the drawing of the Dacres on the bench, studying the faint smudge beside Mr. Dacre's hand. It was no accident, she realized, a detail her artist's eye had captured without her conscious mind registering it. Was it paint, blood, or something else entirely? She closed the book, her resolve hardening. Tomorrow, she would watch the Dacres more closely, and perhaps the sea itself would yield its secrets. Unbeknownst to Joyce, another figure was watching from the shadows. A slight, elderly woman with a lace shawl and a deceptively mild gaze, whose arrival in Rat Hole would soon unravel the threads of deception weaving through the village. Chapter 4. The Arrival of Miss Marple. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of the Polharwyth Arms, casting delicate patterns across the worn oak floor of the dining room. Rat Hole's air of unease had not dissipated with the dawn. If anything, the whispers of the vanishing stain had grown sharper, like a melody played in a minor key. Joyce Lempriere sat at her usual table, her sketchbook closed, her tea untouched. The events of the past 2 days, the Dacres' strained demeanor, the crimson stain that vanished, the cry from the beach, had woven a tapestry of suspicion in her mind, one she could neither unravel nor ignore. The village's chatter, amplified by Mr. Petherick's flair for drama, only deepened her sense that something sinister lurked beneath Rat Hole's picturesque facade. The dining room was quieter than usual, the guests subdued as if the weight of the mystery pressed upon them all. Colonel Bantry was absent, likely tramping the cliffs with his binoculars, while the Vane sisters knitted in silence, their needles moving with mechanical precision. Arthur Penrose, the botanist, was engrossed in a field guide, muttering about tidal algae, but his occasional glances toward Joyce suggested he, too, was caught in the village's web of curiosity. Carol Reeves, the journalist, was nowhere to be seen, though Joyce had spotted her earlier, slipping out with a purposeful stride, her notebook tucked under her arm. As Joyce toyed with a scone, her thoughts drifted to the Dacres. They had not appeared for breakfast, an absence that felt conspicuous, after their prominent presence the previous evening. She recalled Mr. Dacre's polished deflections, his wife's nervous silences, and the faint smudge in her sketch, a detail that nagged at her like a half-remembered dream. Had she seen something more on the promenade, something her artist's eye had captured, but her mind had yet to decipher? Her reverie was interrupted by the soft creak of the inn's door and the arrival of a new guest, a slight, elderly woman whose appearance might have gone unremarked were it not for the keen intelligence in her pale blue eyes. She wore a black dress with a high collar, a lace shawl draped over her shoulders, and a straw hat adorned with a single violet ribbon. Her white hair was neatly pinned, and she carried a tapestry bag that seemed to hold more than its modest size suggested. To the casual observer, she was merely another spinster seeking the sea air, but Joyce sensed something different, a quiet authority, as if the woman carried the weight of countless untold stories. Mr. Petherick bustled over, his smile broad. "Welcome, Miss Marple, to the Polharwyth Arms. You'll find Rat Hole a charming spot, though we've had a bit of excitement lately." He winked, clearly eager to share the tale of the pavement. The woman, Miss Jane Marple, smiled faintly, her voice soft but clear. "So I've heard, Mr. Petherick. My niece-in-law mentioned a curious incident. Something about a stain? I do enjoy a good puzzle." Joyce's ears pricked at the mention of the stain. She watched as Miss Marple settled at a nearby table, her movements deliberate, her eyes scanning the room with a deceptive mildness. The innkeeper launched into a spirited retelling of Joyce's discovery, embellishing the details with a ghostly flourish, but Miss Marple's attention seemed to linger on Joyce herself. "You must be the artist," she said, her tone warm but probing. "Miss Lempriere, is it? I'd love to hear your account of this unusual event." Joyce hesitated, wary of yet another skeptic, but there was something disarming in Miss Marple's gaze, a blend of curiosity and understanding that invited confidence. Over a fresh pot of tea, Joyce recounted the incident, the Dacres' tense exchange, the cry from the beach, the vivid crimson stain, and its baffling disappearance. She described the texture, the warmth, the way it smeared on her fingers, and the constable's dismissal. "Everyone thinks I imagined it," she concluded, her voice tinged with frustration. "But I know what I saw." Miss Marple listened intently, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a pale pink shawl. "My dear," she said at last, "an artist's eye is a rare gift. You see what others miss, the shadows, the nuances. It reminds me of a case in St. Mary Mead, where a young woman noticed a stain on a carpet that everyone else overlooked. It turned out to be quite significant. Her tone was light, but her words carried weight, and Joyce felt a spark of hope. Here was someone who didn't dismiss her as fanciful. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Carol Reeves, her cheeks flushed from the morning air. She carried a small parcel wrapped in brown paper, which she tucked into her bag with a glance around the room. "Miss Lempriere," she said, joining them, "I've been digging into our friends, the Dacres. Did you know Mr. Dacre's business isn't as prosperous as he lets on? I wired a colleague in London. Seems his import firm's been losing contracts. And Mrs. Dacre's family fortune is tied up in a trust he can't touch, unless something happens to her." Joyce's breath caught. "You think he's planning something?" Carol shrugged, her eyes flicking to Miss Marple. "I think it's odd for a couple on a second honeymoon to look so miserable, and that stain, too convenient, disappearing like that." She turned to Miss Marple, introducing herself with a brisk handshake. "You're new here, Miss Marple. Come to solve our little mystery?" Miss Marple's smile was serene. "Oh, I'm just a visitor, Miss Reeves. But I find human nature endlessly fascinating. People are like my knitting patterns. One wrong stitch and the whole design unravels." She paused, her needles still. "Tell me, have either of you seen the Dacres this morning?" Joyce shook her head. "Not since last night. They didn't come down for breakfast." Carol's expression sharpened. "I saw Mr. Dacre earlier near the post office. He was sending a telegram. Looked in a hurry. Mrs. Dacre wasn't with him." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "A telegram, you say? How interesting. In my experience, Telegrams often carry secrets, or at least intentions. She resumed her knitting, but Joyce sensed her mind was far from idle. "Perhaps, Miss Lempriere, you could show me this famous promenade? I'd like to see where your stain appeared." Eager for an ally, Joyce led Miss Marple and Carol to the cliff's edge, where the promenade stretched like a ribbon between the inn and the sea. The bench where the Dacres had sat gleamed in the sunlight, its iron frame unmarred by any trace of crimson. Miss Marple knelt with surprising agility, her fingers brushing the porous stone. "Fascinating," she murmured. "These slabs are quite absorbent, aren't they? A liquid would vanish quickly in this heat, especially if it was meant to." She glanced at Joyce. "You said it was warm to the touch? Like fresh paint, perhaps, or something else?" Joyce nodded, her certainty returning. "It wasn't my paint. I checked my palette. It was untouched, and it didn't feel like paint, not exactly. It was thicker." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the beach below, where the tide was low, exposing a litter of seaweed and shells. "And the cry you heard, where did it come from?" "Down there," Joyce said, pointing. "It was sharp, like someone in trouble. But by the time I looked, there was nothing." Carol, who had been pacing the promenade, stopped abruptly. "Wait, look at this." She pointed to a faint scratch on the bench's armrest, barely visible in the bright light. It was a small, irregular mark, as if something sharp had grazed the metal. "Could be nothing," she said, "but it's new. This wasn't here yesterday." Miss Marple examined the scratch, her expression unreadable. "Very observant, Miss Reeves. Small things often tell large stories. I once knew a case where a scratch on a banister led to quite a revelation." She straightened, her eyes scanning the horizon. "I think we should speak to the fisherman who was on the beach yesterday. He might have seen more than he realized." They found old Tom, a weathered fisherman with hands like gnarled oak, mending nets near the harbor. He squinted at them, his pipe clenched between his teeth. "Aye, I was down there when the lass saw her stain," he said, nodding at Joyce. "Heard a shout, I did. Thought it was a lad caught in the rocks. Happens sometimes, with the tide turning. But when I looked, there was naught but waves." Miss Marple's voice was gentle but insistent. "And did you see anyone else? A boat, perhaps? Or a figure near the water?" Tom puffed on his pipe, his eyes narrowing. "Now you mention it, there was a boat, small, like a dinghy. Rowed out quick, just beyond the breakwater. Couldn't see who was in it, mind. Too far, and the sun was in my eyes." Joyce exchanged a glance with Carol. The boat again. Penrose had mentioned it too. Miss Marple thanked Tom and led the women back to the promenade, her steps slow but purposeful. "A boat that moves quickly, a cry that goes unanswered, a stain that vanishes," she mused. "It's like a pattern with missing stitches. We need more threads to see the whole." That afternoon, the inn buzzed with fresh gossip. Mrs. Dacre had been seen briefly, alone, walking toward the village church, her face pale and her scarf pulled tight despite the warmth. Mr. Dacre, meanwhile, had been spotted at the station inquiring about trains to Plymouth. He said his wife might visit friends there, Mr. Petherick reported, his tone skeptical. But she didn't look like a woman planning a trip. Joyce's unease grew. She confided in Miss Marple, who was now settled in a corner of the lounge, her knitting a constant companion. "I keep thinking about Mrs. Dacre," Joyce said. "She's so quiet, so trapped. And that stain, it was right where they were sitting. What if it was a warning?" Miss Marple's needles paused. "A warning, or perhaps a distraction," she said softly. "People often create illusions to hide truths. I recall a case in St. Mary Mead where a spilled glass of wine was used to cover a far graver act. Tell me, Miss Lempriere, have you looked closely at your sketches from that morning?" Joyce frowned, retrieving her sketchbook. She flipped to the drawing of the Dacres on the bench, the faint smudge beside Mr. Dacre's hand catching her eye once more. "This," she said, pointing. "I didn't notice it when I drew it, but it's there. It's not paint, I'm sure of it." Miss Marple studied the sketch, her lips pursing. "Very curious. And you say Mr. Dacre was holding something. A cigarette lighter, wasn't it? Silver, perhaps?" Joyce nodded, and Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Silver catches the light, but it can also conceal. I wonder." Their conversation was cut short by the arrival of Carol, her expression grim. "I've just heard from my colleague in London," she said, keeping her voice low. "Mr. Dacre's business is on the brink of collapse. He's been borrowing heavily, and there's talk of debts he can't pay. Mrs. Dacre's trust fund is his only lifeline, but it's hers alone, unless she's out of the picture." Joyce's heart pounded. "You mean he might—" "I mean," Carol interrupted, "that we need to watch him closely. And Mrs. Dacre, she's not safe." She glanced at Miss Marple, who was knitting placidly, her face serene. "What do you think, Miss Marple? You've been awfully quiet." The old lady smiled, her eyes sharp. "I think, Miss Reeves, that we have a puzzle with many pieces. The stain, the cry, the boat, the Dacre's behavior. They're all threads in the same pattern. We must be patient and look for the loose end that unravels it all." As evening fell, Joyce joined Miss Marple on the terrace, where the sea whispered secrets to the darkening sky. The old lady's presence was oddly comforting, her quiet confidence a contrast to Joyce's growing anxiety. "Do you think Mrs. Dacre is in danger?" Joyce asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Danger comes in many forms, my dear. Sometimes it's a loud cry, sometimes a silent fear. But I've found that human nature is predictable in its unpredictability. We shall see what tomorrow brings." Joyce nodded, her resolve hardening. With Miss Marple's keen mind and Carol's relentless curiosity, she felt they were closing in on the truth. But the sea, vast and unyielding, seemed to mock their efforts, its depths hiding answers only the tide could reveal. Chapter 5. Shadows of Suspicion. The dawn broke over Rat Hole with a deceptive serenity, the sky a canvas of soft pinks and golds that belied the undercurrent of tension weaving through the village. The Polharwyth Arms, usually a haven of chatter and clinking teacups, felt subdued, as if the mystery of the vanishing stain had cast a shadow over its weathered beams. Joyce Lempriere sat on the inn's terrace, her sketchbook open but untouched, her eyes fixed on the promenade, where the crimson stain had briefly marred the stones. The events of the past days, the Dacres' strained exchanges, the cry from the beach, the boat that slipped away, had knotted themselves into a puzzle she could not unravel alone. Yet, with Miss Marple's arrival, a flicker of hope had ignited. The old lady's quiet acuity, like a lighthouse beam cutting through fog, promised answers where others saw only questions. The morning's peace was shattered by a startling development. Mrs. Dacre had vanished. Mr. Petherick announced it at breakfast, his usual joviality tempered by unease. "Seems Mrs. Dacre left a note for her husband," he said, wiping his hands on his apron. "Gone off to Plymouth, he says, to visit friends. Took the early train, or so the note claims." His tone suggested skepticism, and the dining room buzzed with murmurs. Colonel Bantry, back from his cliffside ramble, snorted. "Flighty woman, probably. Can't trust these modern types to stay put." The Vane sisters exchanged glances, their knitting needles pausing, while Arthur Penrose, the botanist, looked up from his journal, his brow furrowed. Joyce, seated near Miss Marple, felt a chill despite the morning's warmth. "A note?" she whispered. "That's awfully convenient, isn't it?" Miss Marple, her pink shawl draped over her shoulders, nodded thoughtfully, her needles clicking rhythmically. "Very convenient, my dear. Notes can be written by anyone, after all. I recall a case in St. Mary Mead where a note led to quite a misunderstanding, until we found the truth behind it. Carol Reeves, who had slipped in late with a newspaper tucked under her arm, overheard and leaned in. "I checked with the station master," she said, her voice low. "No one matching Mrs. Dacre's description boarded the Plymouth train this morning, and Mr. Dacre was seen at the station yesterday asking about schedules, but he didn't buy a ticket." Her eyes gleamed with the thrill of the chase. "Something's off, Miss Marple. I can smell it." Miss Marple's lips twitched in a faint smile. "Your nose for news is commendable, Miss Reeves, but let us be cautious. Assumptions are like dropped stitches. They can unravel the wrong pattern if we're not careful." She turned to Joyce. "You saw the Dacres closely, my dear. Did Mrs. Dacre seem the sort to leave so abruptly?" Joyce shook her head, her mind replaying Mrs. Dacre's pale face and nervous hands. She was withdrawn, almost frightened. She didn't strike me as someone planning a trip. If anything, she seemed reluctant to leave her husband's side, as if she didn't trust him. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, though her expression remained serene. "Fear is a powerful motivator, Miss Lempriere. It can keep one close or drive one away. We must find out which." She suggested a walk to the village, ostensibly to admire the church's stained glass, but Joyce sensed her true aim was to gather threads of information from Rathole's gossip-prone inhabitants. The trio, Joyce, Carol, and Miss Marple, set out along the cobbled lane leading to the village square. Rathole's charm was undeniable. Whitewashed cottages with roses climbing their walls, the tang of salt mingling with the scent of freshly baked bread from the bakery, and the distant cry of gulls weaving through the air. Yet today, every glance from a passer-by felt weighted, every whispered conversation a potential clue. At the post office, Mrs. Tregarthen, a stout woman with a knack for knowing everyone's business, confirmed Carol's report. "No sign of Mrs. Dacre at the station," she said, her eyes gleaming with curiosity. "But Mr. Dacre was here yesterday, sending a telegram. Looked right agitated, he did." Miss Marple's interest piqued. "A telegram, you say? Did you happen to see the contents, Mrs. Tregarthen? Not that I approve of prying, of course." Her tone was mild, but her gaze was sharp. Mrs. Tregarthen flushed, bustling behind her counter. "Well, I might have glimpsed it, purely by accident, mind. Something about delays and needing funds. Sent to a Mr. Hargreaves in London. Sounded like business, but he was in a hurry to get it off." Carol jotted the name in her notebook, her lips pursed. "Hargreaves. Could be a creditor. I'll wire my colleague to check." She glanced at Miss Marple, who nodded approvingly. "A prudent step, Miss Reeves. Money, I find, is often at the heart of such mysteries." Their next stop was the church, a stone edifice perched on a rise overlooking the harbor. Its cool interior offered respite from the sun, and Joyce paused to admire the stained glass. a depiction of Saint Michael slaying a dragon, its colors vivid against the gray stone. Miss Marple, however, was more interested in the sexton, a wiry man named Jethro who tended the grounds. "Good morning," she greeted, her voice soft but commanding attention. "I hear a lady was seen here yesterday, Mrs. Dacre, perhaps. I'm told she admired the church." Jethro, polishing a brass candlestick, nodded. "Aye, she was here, late afternoon, looked proper upset, kneeling in the pews like she was praying for deliverance. Didn't stay long, hurried out when she heard footsteps, like she didn't want to be seen." Joyce's heart quickened. "Did she say anything?" "Not a word," Jethro replied. "But she dropped something, a bit of paper, crumpled like. I didn't think much of it, tossed it in the bin." He pointed to a small wastebasket near the vestry. Carol, quick as a hawk, retrieved the bin and sifted through its contents, pulling out a torn scrap of paper. It was smudged, but a few words were legible. "Can't go on? Trust. Tomorrow." The handwriting was shaky, unmistakably feminine. Joyce's breath caught. "It's hers," she whispered. "It must be." Miss Marple examined the scrap, her expression grave. "A cry for help, perhaps, or a fragment of despair. We must keep this, but discreetly." She tucked it into her tapestry bag, her movements deft. "Let us return to the inn. I suspect Mr. Dacre will have more to say." Back at the Polharwyth Arms, the atmosphere had shifted. Mr. Dacre was in the lounge, his usual polish fraying at the edges. His tie was slightly askew, and his cigarette case lay open on the table, revealing a faint scratch on its silver surface, a mark that echoed the one on the promenade bench. He greeted the trio with a forced smile. "Ladies, you're out early. Enjoying Rathole's charms?" Miss Marple's smile was disarming. "Oh, indeed, Mr. Dacre. Such a quaint village, though it seems full of surprises. I hear your wife has gone to Plymouth?" Dacre's eyes flickered, but his voice remained steady. "Yes, a sudden whim. She's visiting old friends, likes her independence, my Margaret does." He lit a cigarette, the flame casting a brief shadow across his face. "She left a note, so I'm not concerned." "Curious," Miss Marple said, her tone light. "The station master mentioned no one of her description boarded the train. Perhaps she changed her mind?" Dacre's smile tightened. "You've been busy, haven't you? Margaret's impulsive. She might have taken a later train or gone elsewhere. I don't keep her on a leash." His laugh was hollow, and Joyce noticed his fingers tighten around the cigarette. Carol, never one to shy from a challenge, leaned forward. "And that telegram you sent yesterday, Mr. Dacre? Business troubles, perhaps? I hear your firm's had a rough patch." Dacre's composure faltered, his eyes narrowing. "You've a nose for trouble, Miss Reeves. My business is my own. As for Margaret, she'll turn up when she's ready." He rose abruptly, excusing himself with a curt nod, and strode toward the stairs. Joyce watched him go, her mind racing. "He's lying," she whispered. "That note, the telegram, it's all too neat." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly. "Lies are like loose threads, my dear. Pull one, and the whole fabric comes apart. But we must be careful. Mr. Dacre is a man under pressure, and such men can be unpredictable." That afternoon, Joyce and Carol decided to search the beach below the promenade, hoping for clues the tide might have spared. Miss Marple declined to join them, citing her age, but her eyes suggested she had other plans. The beach was a mosaic of pebbles and seaweed, the air heavy with the scent of salt and decay. Chapter 6. The Artist's Revelation. The sun hung low over Rat Hole, casting long shadows across the cliffs and bathing the village in a golden glow that seemed to mock the growing disquiet within its bounds. The Polharwyth Arms, once a haven of convivial chatter, now thrummed with an undercurrent of suspicion, as if the very walls whispered of secrets yet to be uncovered. Joyce Lempriere sat alone in her attic room, the fading light filtering through the window, her sketchbook open on the table before her. The events of the past days, the crimson stain, the cry from the beach, Mrs. Dacre's sudden absence, had woven a tapestry of doubt that clung to her like damp sea air. Miss Marple's arrival had brought clarity, yet the mystery deepened with each new clue, and Joyce felt as if she were painting a picture with half the colors missing. The scrap of paper found in the church, with its trembling words, "Can't go on, trust, tomorrow," lay heavy on her mind. Was it Mrs. Dacre's plea, a confession, or something else entirely? Joyce's artist's eye, trained to capture fleeting details, kept returning to her sketches from that fateful morning on the promenade. The faint smudge beside Mr. Dacre's hand, unnoticed when she drew it, seemed to pulse with significance. Had she seen something more, something her subconscious had recorded while her mind was distracted by the stain? She flipped through her sketchbook, pausing at the drawing of the Dacres on the bench. The lines were swift, almost careless, capturing the couple's silhouettes against the sea's restless churn. Mr. Dacre's posture was relaxed, one hand resting on the bench, the other holding his silver cigarette lighter. Mrs. Dacre, by contrast, was rigid, her hands clasped tightly, her head turned toward the horizon. The smudge, irregular, faintly gray, lay near the bench's armrest, where the scratch Carol had noticed now seemed more than coincidental. Joyce traced the lines with her finger, her pulse quickening. "It's not paint," she murmured. "But what is it?" A knock at the door startled her. It was Carol Reeves, her eyes bright with the restless energy of a hunter closing in on her quarry. "Joyce, you've got to see this," she said, holding up a folded newspaper. "My colleague in London sent it by express. It's about Dacre's business, more than just debts. There's talk of fraud, shady deals with overseas suppliers. He's desperate for cash, and Mrs. Dacre's trust fund is his only way out." Joyce's breath caught. "You think he's done something to her? That note in the church, it sounded like she was afraid." Carol nodded, her lips tight. "And that telegram to Hargreaves? My contact says he's a moneylender, not exactly the reputable sort. Dacre's in deep, and a man like that doesn't let a fortune slip through his fingers." She glanced at the sketchbook. "Still obsessing over your drawings? Find anything new?" Joyce hesitated, then pointed to the smudge. "This. I didn't notice it when I drew it, but it's there, right where the bench was scratched. It's not my pencil. It's too deliberate, like it was meant to be seen." Carol leaned closer, her brow furrowing. Could be a shadow, or maybe something he dropped. That lighter of his. Silver, right? It catches the light oddly. Maybe it's connected. She straightened, her voice brisk. "We need to show this to Miss Marple. That old lady's got a mind like a razor." They found Miss Marple in the inn's lounge, seated by a window overlooking the harbor, her knitting a soft blur of pink wool. The room was quiet, save for the murmur of the Vane sisters discussing a local flower show and the occasional clink of Mr. Petherick's glasses behind the bar. Miss Marple looked up as they approached, her eyes twinkling with that deceptive mildness that masked her sharp intellect. "Good evening, ladies," she said. You've the look of those who've found a new stitch in our pattern. What is it?" Joyce opened her sketchbook, pointing to the smudge. "This was in my drawing from the morning of the stain. I didn't notice it at the time, but it's right where the bench was scratched. And here—" She flipped to another sketch, a hasty outline of the promenade itself, where a faint line curved near the cliff's edge. I thought it was just a wave, but it could be something else. A rope, maybe, or a shadow. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles, studying the drawings with care. "Very interesting, my dear. An artist's hand captures what the eye misses. This smudge, could it be ash, perhaps, or something metallic catching the light?" She paused, her needles still. "And this line? It does resemble a rope, doesn't it? I once knew a case in St. Mary Mead where a shadow in a photograph revealed more than the photographer intended." Carol, impatient, cut in. "Miss Marple, I've got news from London. Dacre's business is crumbling. Fraud, debts, the works. And that telegram he sent was to a moneylender. If Mrs. Dacre's gone, it's no coincidence. That trust fund of hers is his lifeline." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her eyes sharpened. "Money is a powerful motive, Miss Reeves. It drives people to desperate acts, like a poorly knitted scarf that unravels under strain. But we mustn't leap to conclusions. Mrs. Dacre's absence could mean many things: fear, flight, or something darker. We need more threads." Joyce, emboldened, spoke up. "I keep thinking about the tide. The stain vanished so quickly, and old Tom said the tide was coming in that morning. Could it have washed something away? Something from the beach?" Miss Marple nodded, her needles resuming their rhythm. "A pertinent observation, Miss Lempriere. The tide is a great concealer, as I learned in a case involving a lost brooch that wasn't lost at all. Let us visit the beach again, but first, I'd like to speak with Mr. Dacre. His story about this note interests me." They found Mr. Dacre in the inn's garden, pacing near a rose bush, his cigarette smoke curling into the evening air. His usual polish was fraying, his collar was slightly crumpled, and his eyes darted toward the cliffs with a restlessness that belied his earlier nonchalance. "Ladies," he greeted, forcing a smile. "Out for an evening stroll?" Miss Marple's tone was gentle, almost grandmotherly. "Oh, just enjoying the air, Mr. Dacre. We were wondering about your wife's trip to Plymouth. It's unusual, isn't it, to leave so suddenly without a word to anyone?" Dacre's smile tightened, his fingers flicking ash from his cigarette. "Margaret's impulsive, as I've said. She left a note, clear as day. Said she'd be back in a day or two. I don't see why it's anyone's business." His voice held an edge, and Joyce noticed his hand tremble slightly as he lit another cigarette. Carol, never one to mince words, pressed further. "No one saw her at the station, Mr. Dacre, and that telegram you sent, business troubles perhaps. Must be hard, with your firm in such a state." Dacre's eyes flashed, but he recovered quickly. "You're a nosy lot, aren't you? My business is fine, thank you. As for Margaret, she's free to come and go. If you'll excuse me, I have matters to attend to." He turned abruptly, striding toward the inn, his cigarette case glinting in the fading light. Joyce watched him go, her mind racing. "He's hiding something," she whispered. "That note? It's too convenient, like the stain." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze fixed on the sea. "Convenience is often a mask, my dear, but masks slip, given time. Let us examine the beach tomorrow at low tide, and Miss Reeves, perhaps your colleague could look into this Mr. Hargreaves further. A moneylender's involvement is rarely innocent." The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the tide retreating to reveal a stretch of pebbled beach littered with seaweed and driftwood. Joyce, Carol, and Miss Marple descended the narrow path to the shore, the air sharp with salt and the distant cry of gulls. Old Tom, mending his nets nearby, waved them over. "Back again, are you? Still chasing that stain?" he teased, but his eyes were curious. Miss Marple smiled. "Just a morning walk, Mr. Tom. Though I wonder, did you find anything unusual after that cry you heard? A piece of cloth, perhaps, or something washed ashore?" Tom scratched his beard, thoughtful. "Now you mention it, there was a bit of fabric caught in the rocks yesterday. Blue, like a lady's scarf. Thought it was just flotsam, so I left it. Tide's likely taken it by now." Joyce's heart sank, but Carol was already scrambling over the rocks, her eyes scanning the shore. "Here," she called, holding up a tattered scrap of blue silk, its edges frayed but unmistakable. "It's hers. I saw Mrs. Dacre wearing a scarf like this the first day." Miss Marple examined the fabric, her expression grave. "Very curious. And look, there's a faint stain here, reddish, like your pavement, Miss Lempriere." She held it to the light, revealing a smear that matched Joyce's memory of the crimson stain. Joyce's pulse raced. "It's not paint, it's blood, isn't it?" Miss Marple's voice was calm but firm. "We mustn't jump to conclusions, but this is significant. We should keep it safe and show it to the constable, though I suspect he'll need more convincing than we do." Back at the inn, Joyce returned to her sketchbook, her fingers trembling as she studied the smudge again. Under the lamplight it seemed clearer, a metallic sheen, perhaps, or ash, as Miss Marple had suggested. She recalled Mr. Dacre's cigarette lighter, its silver surface catching the sun, and the scratch on the bench. Had he dropped something, or used it to create the illusion of the stain? And the line in her other sketch, the one she'd thought was a wave. Could it be a rope used to drag something into the sea? Carol, meanwhile, had wired her colleague for more on Hargreaves, and the reply came swiftly. A notorious moneylender with ties to unsavory circles, known for ruthless tactics. "Dacre's in deep with him," Carol said, her voice grim. "If he needs Mrs. Dacre's money, he'd do anything to get it." Miss Marple, knitting quietly, listened to their findings. "We have a pattern, ladies, but it's not complete. The stain, the scarf, the note, they're all stitches in a larger design. I suggest we watch Mr. Dacre closely tonight. Men under pressure often make mistakes." That evening, the inn's lounge was tense, the guests' chatter subdued. Mr. Dacre appeared briefly, his eyes bloodshot, his charm strained. He claimed to have received a telegram from Mrs. Dacre, confirming her stay in Plymouth, but he refused to show it, citing privacy. Joyce noticed his cigarette case again, its scratch more pronounced in the lamplight. Was it a clue or another distraction? As the night deepened, Joyce, Carol, and Miss Marple convened in the lounge's corner, the scarf and sketchbook before them. "We're close," Joyce whispered. "But what does it mean? Is Mrs. Dacre alive, or—" Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes distant. "Alive or not, my dear, the truth is in the details. Like a painting, it's the smallest brushstrokes that reveal the whole. Tomorrow, we must confront Mr. Dacre with what we know, but carefully. A cornered man is a dangerous one." The sea roared beyond the inn, its secrets locked in its depths, but Joyce felt the net tightening. With Miss Marple's guidance, the artist's revelation was bringing them closer to the heart of Rat Hole's mystery. Chapter 7. The Tide Turns. The evening draped Rat-Hole in a velvet hush, broken only by the restless churn of the sea against the cliffs. The Polharwyth Arms, its windows glowing like beacons in the gathering dusk, held an air of expectancy, as if the inn itself sensed the unraveling of secrets within its walls. Joyce Lempriere stood on the terrace, her sketchbook clutched tightly, the weight of their discoveries pressing upon her. The blue scarf with its reddish smear, the cryptic note from the church, the smudge in her drawing, each was a thread in a pattern that Miss Marple's keen mind was weaving into clarity. Yet the absence of Mrs. Dacre loomed like a storm cloud, and Mr. Dacre's evasions only deepened the mystery. The tide, Joyce thought, was turning, and with it, the truth would surely surface. Inside, the lounge was a tableau of suppressed tension. The Vane sisters, their knitting abandoned, whispered over cups of cocoa, their eyes darting toward the door where Mr. Dacre had last been seen. Colonel Bantry, nursing a whiskey, grumbled about village hysterics, but his usual bluster lacked conviction. Arthur Penrose, the botanist, sat in a corner, his journal open but untouched, his gaze fixed on the flickering fire. Carol Reeves paced near the bar, her notebook brimming with notes from her London contact, while Miss Marple, serene as ever, knitted by the window, her pink shawl a soft contrast to the storm brewing in her thoughts. Joyce joined them, her voice low. "I can't stop thinking about the scarf," she said, glancing at Miss Marple. "That stain. It's the same color as the one on the pavement. And the note, it's like Mrs. Dacre was trying to tell us something." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes twinkling in the lamplight. "Indeed, my dear. A stain that vanishes, a scarf left behind, a note that speaks of despair. These are not accidents. They are stitches in a pattern, and we are close to seeing its shape. I think it's time we had a little gathering to clear the air." Carol's eyebrows shot up. "You mean confront Dacre? Lay out what we know?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle but firm. "Not confront, Miss Reeves. Invite. People reveal themselves when they think they're in control. I've seen it before, in a case involving a missing necklace that wasn't missing at all. We shall ask Mr. Dacre to join us, along with a few others, and see what slips through the cracks." With Mr. Petherick's assistance, they arranged a small gathering in the inn's parlor, a cozy room lined with nautical charts and faded photographs of Rat-Hole's fishing days. Miss Marple suggested inviting Constable Trewin, whose skepticism might be swayed by evidence, as well as old Tom, whose memory of the beach could prove crucial. Joyce and Carol rounded out the group, their roles as witnesses vital to the unfolding drama. Mr. Dacre, when summoned, agreed with a strained smile, his cigarette case glinting as he took a seat near the fire. The parlor was lit by a single lamp, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. Miss Marple, seated in an armchair like a benign matriarch, began with her usual disarming courtesy. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice soft but commanding attention. "Rat-Hole is such a charming place, but it seems to have a puzzle or two. Miss Lempriere's discovery on the promenade has set tongues wagging, and I thought we might piece it together." Mr. Dacre's laugh was a touch too loud. "Really, Miss Marple, you're making a mountain out of a molehill, a spot of spilled wine, nothing more. My wife's off in Plymouth, as I've said. No need for all this fuss." Joyce, emboldened by Miss Marple's presence, spoke up. "It wasn't wine, Mr. Dacre. I saw it. Red, thick, like blood. and it was right where you and Mrs. Dacre were sitting. Then there's this." She produced the blue scarf, its reddish smear stark under the lamplight. "We found it on the beach, where old Tom heard a cry." Dacre's eyes narrowed, but his voice remained steady. "A scarf? Could belong to anyone. And cries on the beach. Fishermen, gulls, who knows? You're seeing mysteries where there are none." Old Tom, puffing on his pipe, cleared his throat. "Beggin' your pardon, sir, but that cry wasn't no gull. Sharp it was, like someone in trouble. And that boat I saw rowing out fast didn't look like no fisherman's skiff." Carol, her notebook open, leaned forward. "And your telegram, Mr. Dacre, to a moneylender, wasn't it? Your business is in trouble, and Mrs. Dacre's trust fund is out of reach unless she's gone. No one saw her at the station, and that note you mentioned sounds awfully convenient." Dacre's composure cracked, his hand tightening on his cigarette case. "You've no right to pry into my affairs. Margaret left of her own accord. I've a telegram from her today, confirming she's in Plymouth. This is slander." Miss Marple's voice cut through the tension, calm but incisive. "May we see this telegram, Mr. Dacre? It would set minds at ease, and perhaps you could explain this." She held up Joyce's sketch, the smudge beside the bench, circled in pencil. "Miss Lempriere's drawing captures a curious detail, a mark near where you sat, matching a scratch on your cigarette case. And this line—" She pointed to the sketch of the promenade, where the curved shape hinted at a rope. "It suggests something was moved, perhaps to the water." Dacre's face paled, but he rallied. "You're grasping at straws. A scratch, a drawing. What does it prove?" "My wife's fine, I tell you." Constable Trewin, who had been listening with growing unease, shifted in his seat. "Now, sir, no need to get heated, but this scarf and Miss Lempriere's account, it's worth looking into. Can you show us that note from your wife?" Dacre hesitated, then produced a folded paper from his pocket. "Here," he said, thrusting it at the constable. "See for yourself." The note was brief, written in a neat, feminine hand. "Gone to Plymouth to see friends. Back soon. Margaret." It was unsigned, and Joyce noticed a faint tremor in the script, as if written under duress. Miss Marple examined it, her lips pursing. "A tidy note, Mr. Dacre, but it raises questions. Why no signature? And why leave so suddenly without a word to anyone?" She turned to Joyce. "Your stain, my dear, describe it again." Every detail Joyce recounted: the crimson smear, its warmth, its viscosity, and its swift disappearance. "It wasn't my paint," she insisted. "I checked my palette. Nothing was spilled, and it was right where they sat." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes distant. "I think, ladies and gentlemen, we have a case of misdirection. The stain was no accident. It was meant to be seen, to draw eyes to the pavement while something else happened below. Mr. Dacre, you're fond of your cigarette lighter, aren't you? Silver, with a scratch that matches the bench. And I wonder, did you carry anything else that morning? A small can, perhaps, hidden in your pocket." Dacre's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Miss Marple continued, her voice soft but relentless. "The tide was high that morning, wasn't it? Perfect for concealing a struggle in the shallows, a cry, quickly muffled, a boat rowing away. These are not coincidences. And the stain, red paint, I suspect, from Mrs. Dacre's own supplies, used to create an illusion of violence while the real act took place below." The room fell silent, the fire's crackle the only sound. Joyce's heart pounded as the pieces fell into place. "You mean he drowned her?" she whispered. Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "I mean, my dear, that Mr. Dacre needed his wife's fortune, and her presence was an obstacle. The stain was a distraction, the note a fabrication. The scarf, left behind, tells the truth the tide was meant to hide." Dacre sprang to his feet, his face contorted. "This is outrageous. You've no proof, just a scrap of silk and a girl's imagination. I'll have you for slander." But his voice cracked, and his hands shook as he fumbled with his cigarette case. Constable Trewin stood, his expression grim. "That's enough, sir. I think you'd better come with me. We'll need to search your room and check with Plymouth. If Mrs. Dacre's there, we'll find her. If not—" He left the threat unspoken. As Dacre was led away, protesting, Joyce turned to Miss Marple, her voice trembling. "How did you know?" The old lady smiled, her needles resuming their rhythm. "Human nature, my dear. It's like a badly knitted scarf. Pull one thread, and it all comes apart. I've seen it before, in a case involving a forged letter and a missing heiress. The trick is to notice the loose ends." Carol, scribbling furiously, looked up. But the boat? What was it doing? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. A means of escape, perhaps, or a way to dispose of evidence. We'll know more when the constable investigates. But I suspect Mr. Dacre acted in haste, and haste makes mistakes. As the tide rolled in, its roar a fitting backdrop to the drama, Joyce felt a weight lift. The truth was emerging, like a painting taking shape from scattered strokes. With Miss Marple's guidance, the shadows of suspicion were giving way to clarity, and Rathole's secrets could no longer hide in the depths. Chapter 8. The Unraveling Thread. The night had settled over Rathole like a heavy curtain, the sea's ceaseless murmur a counterpoint to the charged silence within the Polharwyth Arms. The parlor, where Miss Marple had deftly unraveled the threads of Mr. Dacre's deception, still hummed with the aftershock of her revelations. Joyce Lempriere stood by the window, her breath fogging the glass, as she stared at the moonlit promenade, its stones now innocent of the crimson stain that had sparked their inquiry. The confrontation had left her shaken, yet exhilarated. Miss Marple's quiet certainty had transformed scattered clues into a damning pattern, and Mr. Dacre's arrest marked the climax of their pursuit. But the mystery was not fully resolved. Loose ends remained, like brushstrokes on a canvas yet to be completed, and Joyce sensed the final truth lay just beyond their grasp. The inn's lounge was nearly deserted, its usual warmth dimmed by the evening's drama. The Vane sisters had retired, their whispers trailing them like shadows, while Colonel Bantry, chastened by the turn of events, sipped his whiskey in silence. Arthur Penrose, the botanist, lingered by the fire, his journal forgotten as he stared into the flames, perhaps re-evaluating his dismissal of village gossip. Carol Reeves, her notebook brimming with notes for a sensational article, paced restlessly, her eyes alight with the thrill of a story breaking open. Miss Marple, serene as ever, sat in her corner, her knitting needles clicking softly, the pink shawl in her lap a testament to her unruffled calm. Joyce approached her, clutching her sketchbook, her voice low. "Miss Marple, do you really think it's over?" Mr. Dacre's confession was so sudden. And Mrs. Dacre, what if she's still out there somewhere? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression was grave. "My dear, a confession is only as good as the truth it holds." Mr. Dacre admitted to the act, but men under pressure often say what they think will save them. We must be sure all the stitches are secure before we call the pattern complete." She paused, her needles still. "Your sketches, Miss Lempriere, those smudges and lines, they've been most illuminating. Might I see them again?" Joyce opened her sketchbook, flipping to the drawing of the Dacres on the bench. The smudge beside Mr. Dacre's hand, now circled in pencil, seemed to pulse with new meaning, especially in light of the scratch on his cigarette case and the bench's armrest. The second sketch of the promenade showed that faint, curving line she had mistaken for a wave, a line Miss Marple had suggested might be a rope. "I keep wondering about this," Joyce said, pointing to the smudge. "It's not pencil, not paint. Could it be ash, like you mentioned, or something else?" Miss Marple studied the drawing, her lips pursing. "Ash, perhaps, or a metallic residue. Silver, for instance, can leave a mark when scraped against stone. And that rope-like line, it suggests something was moved, perhaps dragged to the water's edge. I recall a case in St. Mary Mead where a smudge on a windowsill led to a most unexpected discovery." She glanced at Carol, who had joined them, her notebook open. "Miss Reeves, what did your colleague say about Mr. Hargreaves, the moneylender? His role in this may yet hold a key." Carol's eyes narrowed, her voice crisp. "Hargreaves is a shark, lends to desperate men like Dacre, then squeezes them dry. My contact says Dacre owes him a fortune, and Hargreaves has been pressing for payment. There's a rumor he's got connections to some rough types, men who don't mind getting their hands dirty to collect a debt." Miss Marple nodded, her needles resuming their rhythm. "Very interesting. A man in debt to such a figure might act rashly, especially if a fortune is within reach. But we must consider, did Mr. Dacre act alone, or was someone else involved? That boat old Tom saw, rowing away so swiftly, it suggests a second player." Joyce's heart quickened. "You think someone helped him? The boat, Penrose saw it too, but couldn't make out who was in it." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, where the sea gleamed silver under the moon. "The sea is a great keeper of secrets, my dear, but it cannot hide everything. We must look closer at the beach and at Mr. Dacre's belongings. His cigarette case, for instance. Its scratch matches the bench, but what else might it tell us?" The next morning, with Constable Truan's reluctant permission, Joyce, Carol, and Miss Marple accompanied him to search Mr. Dacre's room. The constable, still smarting from his earlier dismissal of Joyce's claims, was now grimly determined to uncover the truth. Dacre, detained in the village lockup, had protested his innocence, insisting his wife was alive and well in Plymouth. But a telegram from the Plymouth police, relayed by Carol's contacts, confirmed no trace of Mrs. Dacre at the address Dacre had provided. The room was tidy, almost too perfect, as if staged for inspection. The bed was neatly made, the wardrobe held only a few suits and dresses, and a small suitcase sat in the corner, its lock gleaming. Joyce's eyes were drawn to a wooden box on the dresser, its lid adorned with a faint floral carving. "Mrs. Dacre's art supplies," she said, recognizing the style. She was a painter, like me. Miss Marple opened the box, revealing tubes of paint, brushes, and a small jar of turpentine. Among them was a tube of alizarin crimson, its cap loose, a faint smear of red on its rim. "Curious," Miss Marple murmured, holding it up. "This is your color, Miss Lempriere, the one you said wasn't yours. Yet here it is, in Mrs. Dacre's possession." Joyce's breath caught. "But I checked my paints. They were all accounted for. This must be what he used for the stain. Carol, rifling through a drawer, produced a small notebook, its pages filled with figures and cryptic notes. "Look at this," she said, her voice sharp. "Debts, payments, dates, all to Hargreaves. And here," she pointed to an entry dated the day before the stain appeared. A note about a delivery to the cove. Could that be the boat? Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. A delivery, or perhaps a disposal. Let us take this to the constable, and then we must revisit the beach. The tide is low this morning, perfect for finding what it may have left behind. The beach below the promenade was a rugged expanse of pebbles and seaweed, its jagged rocks slick with salt. Old Tom joined them, his pipe clenched between his teeth, his eyes scanning the shore with a fisherman's instinct. "Tide's been kind today," he said, pointing to a cluster of rocks near the breakwater. "Sometimes it leaves things caught in the crevices, nets, bottles, even a shoe or two." Joyce, her heart pounding, followed his lead, her eyes searching for anything out of place. Carol, ever tenacious, scrambled over the rocks, her boots slipping on the wet stones. "Here," she called, holding up a small object glinting in the sunlight. A woman's brooch, its sapphire center cracked but unmistakable. "Mrs. Dacre wore this the first day I saw her," Carol said, her voice grim. "It was pinned to her dress." Miss Marple examined the brooch, her expression grave. "Another thread, ladies, and look, there's a trace of red here, caught in the clasp. Paint, perhaps, or something more." She turned to old Tom. "You mentioned a cove nearby where boats sometimes land. Could you show us?" The cove was a narrow inlet, hidden by a jut of cliff, its entrance barely visible from the promenade above. The sand was soft, marked by faint ridges that suggested recent disturbance. Joyce noticed a piece of rope, half buried, its end frayed as if cut. "This," she said, holding it up. "It's like the line in my sketch." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes scanning the cove. "A rope, a brooch, a scarf, all left behind, like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale. I suspect Mr. Dacre used this cove to stage his plan, perhaps with help. The boat was no fisherman's. It was a means to an end." Back at the inn, Constable Trewin was poring over the notebook, his face grim. "This is damning," he said. "Debts to Hargreaves, and this delivery. Sounds like Dacre had a plan to settle his accounts one way or another." He looked at Miss Marple, his skepticism replaced by grudging respect. "You were right about the paint, ma'am. We found a small can in Dacre's suitcase, hidden in a false bottom. Alizarin crimson, same as the missis's supplies." Miss Marple's smile was modest. "It was a simple trick, Constable, but clever. The paint drew attention to the pavement, while the real act took place below. Masked by the tide, and that cry old Tom heard, I suspect Mr. Dacre acted in haste, driven by his debts, and used his wife's own supplies to create the illusion of a struggle." Joyce's mind raced, piecing together the final strokes. "So he drowned her in the shallows, used the paint to stage a scene on the promenade, and rowed her body out to sea in that boat. The note was to buy time, make us think she'd left." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly. "Precisely, my dear. The scarf, the brooch, they were mistakes, left behind in his rush. And the rope, it tethered something to the boat, perhaps to ensure it sank beyond reach. But human nature, as I've often said, is careless under pressure." Carol, her pen flying across her notebook, looked up. "But the boat? Who was in it? Dacre couldn't have rowed it alone and been back on the promenade so quickly." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. A pertinent question, Miss Reeves. I suspect Mr. Hargreaves's associates may have played a role. A man in debt often turns to dangerous allies. The constable might inquire in Plymouth. Such men leave traces. As night fell, the inn settled into an uneasy calm, the truth settling like dust after a storm. Mr. Dacre, now in custody, faced further questioning, while the constable sent word to Plymouth to investigate Hargreaves's network. Joyce, Carol, and Miss Marple sat in the parlor, the fire casting warm shadows across their faces. Joyce turned to Miss Marple, her voice soft. "How do you do it? See through all the lies, the distractions?" The old lady smiled, her knitting a steady rhythm. "It's no great trick, my dear. People are like my scarves, full of patterns, but always with a loose thread if you know where to look. I've seen it before, in a case involving a stolen painting that wasn't stolen at all. The trick is patience and a bit of faith in human folly." As the tide rolled in, its roar a solemn requiem, Joyce felt the weight of the mystery lift. The unraveling thread had led them to the truth, and though Mrs. Dacre's fate was a tragedy, the clarity brought by Miss Marple's insight was a kind of solace. Rathole, with its secrets laid bare, could begin to heal, and Joyce's canvas, once marred by doubt, was complete at last.